We talk a lot about tariffs right now for the last, it feels like 2 years with the election and the pre-election. And I mean, it seems like the election process, it goes on for a long time. So we've talked about this for a very long time at this point. And, there's been references to tariffs back in the day in US history in the past, but a lot of focus is on the tariffs we're doing in the future. I'm just curious, I understand we've had tariffs. We've been doing tariffs for 100 years for as long as possible. Can you give us sort of a brief history, or synopsis or whatever it may be, where we're not here till later tonight talking about it, but to understand sort of where they've been, because, you keep hearing people referencing back to the early 1900s when tariffs were doing amazing to where there was times where it seems like we didn't have as many tariffs being imposed on foreign goods coming into the country. So just wondering if you could give us a quick overview of the history of tariffs within this country and how they sort of affected us.
Yeah, so globally, tariffs go back all the way, back to the early days of trade as countries tried to balance their trade imbalances, right? They tried to make sure they could, survive essentially from a fiscal perspective. In the US, we can go all the way back to 1789. And there was a Tariff Act in 1789 that gave Congress the ability to impose tariffs. And then in 1974, they adjusted that and they granted presidential or executive authority to impose it during times of national security interest or a national emergency. So if you go back and you remember in the very first days of the Trump administration this term, maybe the first day, do you remember he imposed a national emergency at the southern port? He also imposed a national energy emergency, and I think there may have even been an economic emergency in there. That was to go ahead and grant the presidential powers to be able to impose tariffs as fast as he wants to impose them. Okay,
That
and that
was good.
freed that authority up. Yeah,
Okay.
it moved it away from Congress and moved it into his, basically his ability to do that. Now, the Biden administration did exactly the same thing, so I'm not picking on Trump at all. This has been used administration by administration for the longest period of time. But the reason why they did the 1974 Act was because in like times of war, sometimes it's necessary for the president to invoke invoke tariffs very, very quickly. He can poke them too, but he's going to invoke them. But he's but he can invoke those tariffs in a time of national emergency or pull them away to be able to free up the flow of resources. Like, during World War II, we needed steel and we needed a lot of materials to feed the war machine. And if there were tariffs on them at the time, you needed to be able to very quickly go and just reduce all those tariffs to get those flowing. And so that gives that power to the president. And yeah, so for now, with a national emergency invoked, he can use those powers and he can add them quickly. He can also take them off quickly. It really is up to him.
Okay. And I guess that leads us into what I was looking at next was the adjusting of tariffs over time, because it seems like every day a tariff can be changed from we're imposing 25 or we're bringing it down to 10 or we're moving it up to 30. I know there's been swaths of time where tariffs have stayed steady at a certain percentage through certain administrations. And as you said, it's not just one, it could be multiple. I mean, we're looking at a decade, that's multiple administrations right there, but they can stay static. And then you could see blips, where they go up or so. Are they very fluid to a point where it's just you can sort of make changes on a daily basis if needed or keep them the same? Because I know you mentioned the difference between the president having the power once they triggered the national emergency to where it used to be with Congress. So I'm just curious about the difference in fluidity of not only the tariffs, but if that changes with who has the power of the tariffs at that time.
Absolutely. So there's the policy side of things and there's the practice side. So the policy side, he can change his mind as often and as frequently as he wants. The practice side is a little more complicated because they've got to get the tariff applications down into the customs border facilities at the ports. It's got to process through electronic systems. You've got payment systems in place that connect, where the tax is paid to the U.S. Treasury. So there's a physical, structural piece of this where applying a tariff or pulling the tariff away creates a series of changes in paperwork, supply chain movement. So theoretically, yes, he could say an hour from now, hey, those 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, you know, just a bluff, my bad, we're not going to apply them. But there is a process that has to be taken on the practice side of things that doesn't make that real feasible. So I think you can see rapid changes, but that's also why, when he announced the tariffs, they set a deadline out there of like March 4th to apply them. And then the next wave of tariff, they're saying April 2nd. And then maybe
Mhm.
the next phase may be May 1st, because there is that adjustment period where everyone's got to adjust their systems to know what that harmonized tariff rate is, apply it. But it is a very fluid situation on the policy side of things. So you've got officials from Mexico and Canada and even China meeting behind closed doors on an hourly basis right now, throwing offers back and forth across the table to try and figure out how we can soften the impact of those tariffs. And the administration, since it's presidential executive authority, he could say at any time, "Hey, I've changed my mind, and politically, I've gotten enough out of Mexico that I'm going to go ahead and cut that tariff from 25% down to 5 or 10." And he could do that at any time.
So you said the practical side. So that's going to be, the border and custom officials that are sitting at ports or port of entries across the border from Mexico that are collecting these taxes, or I guess they're not showing up with envelopes to pay their taxes at the time, but at least make note of the product or coming over the border so that we know who to tax in the future. So that, as you said, makes it difficult because if we're changing it on a hourly basis or sooner or not having enough lead time, it's not trickling down to the people in these ports of entry to be able to make the adjustments themselves. So it's a lot more than just pulling a lever to say, we're at 5, we're at 15, we're at 25, because as you said, there's physical people and programs in place that actually have to collect this. And if you're changing it, they don't know what they're collecting at that particular time. Is
That's right, and that's why you'll also see them. Yeah, that's why you'll actually see them put deadlines in there or parameters to say any goods that hit U.S. ports by such and such date will be subject to the new tariff. Because if
Mhm.
I'm a purchasing manager and I'm moving something in from China and they're giving me a port arrival date of say March 29th,
Yep.
and if the tariff is being imposed on April 1st, I'm ahead of it. I don't need to worry about it. I don't need to worry about filing the paperwork and adjusting prices and making those decisions. But if I know it's going to land after that, I may make volume decisions. I may decide that if I'm going to pay that tariff, I'm going to trim it back, hoping maybe they ease tariffs in the future. And so I may not inbound as much as I would on a normal shipment. I go with smaller items just to keep myself in stock, and then later on place a bigger order, hoping those tariffs will come down. So that they know that purchasing managers and companies are making those adjustments on the fly right now, and so they've got to give them time to adjust.